Podcast 3 of the Thorax series, the Pleura. This podcast is going to detail the anatomy of the pleura. The pleura is a double layer of serous membrane that surrounds the lungs and lines the inside of the thoracic cavity. There are two layers that make up the pleura, the visceral and the parietal. The parietal pleura lines the inside of the thoracic wall and is in contact with the ribs laterally, anteriorly and posteriorly, and also the diaphragm inferiorly. The visceral pleura is in intimate contact with the lungs and covers all the deep grooves and fissures. These two layers of pleura, the parietal and the visceral, are continuous at the hilum of the lung, and between them is the pleural cavity, which contains a thin film of serous fluid. So let's describe the arrangement of the pleura and how it forms this pleural cavity. An easy way to try and appreciate its anatomy is to imagine the thoracic cavity without any lungs present. So in this now empty thoracic cavity, if you can imagine placing two balloons, one into the left side and one into the right side, then these balloons can represent the entire serous membrane, which is the pleura. If you now push these balloons against the inside of the thoracic wall, then that layer of balloon that is in contact with the ribs is the parietal pleura. Now if you place two objects into the central portion of the thoracic cavity, where the heart would be, in between these two balloons, and if you push these laterally into the balloons, then these can be the lungs. And as you push each lung against the balloon, so you can position them in the left and right compartments. As you pushed each lung laterally, it took with it a layer of the balloon, and this layer now covers the entire surface of the lung, and this is your visceral pleura. You can also imagine this in the lab by blowing up a latex glove to form a balloon and pushing your finger into it. The part of the balloon that covers your finger represents the visceral pleura, whilst the outer surface of the balloon can attach to the thoracic wall and represents the parietal pleura. You should notice that these two parts of the pleura, the parietal and visceral, are continuous at the points where the balloon leaves your finger, and this can represent the hilum of the lung. So as I mentioned previously, the visceral pleura that surrounds the lungs and the parietal pleura that lines the thoracic wall are held in contact by a thin layer of serous fluid that occupies the space between the visceral and parietal pleura. This space is the pleural cavity, and the serous fluid allows the two pleural surfaces to freely slide against one another when you breathe. You can imagine this space if you return to your latex glove that you inflated. If you once again push your finger into the balloon, then the air inside the balloon can represent the pleural cavity. If we just have a look at the parietal pleura in a bit more detail, then the parietal pleura can be divided into regions depending on its location. So the parietal pleura that lines the lateral surface of the mediastinum is the mediastinal pleura. The pleura that lines the inside of the ribs is known as the costal pleura. Superiorly, the parietal pleura extends into the base of the neck, and this region is known as the cervical pleura. Inferiorly, the parietal pleura extends down over the diaphragm, and this is the diaphragmatic pleura. Now, as I detailed in the previous podcast, the diaphragm slopes sharply downwards towards the thoracic wall and creates the costodiaphragmatic recess, and this recess is going to be lined by both diaphragmatic and costal parts of the parietal pleura. This recess contains a collection of serous fluid, and with forced inspiration, this recess can become flattened. So to finish the podcast, let's just detail the nerves that innervate the pleura. The parietal pleura receives its innervation via the intercostal and phrenic nerves, which are part of the somatic nervous system, and therefore have both sensory and motor parts. You should be aware that the phrenic nerve is motor to the diaphragm, originating from the third, fourth and fifth cervical segments of the spinal cord. Remember, C3, 4, 5 keeps the diaphragm alive, or sensory information from the parietal pleura that covers the mediastinum and central portion of the diaphragm is returned to the spinal cord via these two phrenic nerves. The remaining regions of the parietal pleura, so the cervical, costal and peripheral diaphragmatic parts, are all supplied by the intercostal nerves. The visceral pleura is not supplied by these somatic nerves, but receives its innervation via the autonomic nerves which supply the lungs. In the next podcast, number 4 in the Thorax series, I will describe the anatomy of the lungs.